Let's see what we're saying so far. This looks to me like a room that might have a few researchers in it, because it's pretty rare that you see the need of data being number one, but I think I would have voted that way too. Okay, let me let you know briefly about today. The way this is going to work is I'm going to give a brief introduction, introduce our speakers. They're each going to have about 10 minutes to summarize their presentation, followed by about 20 minutes for Q&A and 20 minutes for discussion at your tables. So, by way of introduction, our first speaker today is going to be Linda Darling-Hammond. She's the Charles E. Duckhorn Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University and President of the Learning Policy Institute. In her long and distinguished career, she started a preschool and a high school, been the faculty sponsor of the Stanford Teacher Education Program, and is one of the most influential thinkers in the education policy landscape. Catherine Strunk is the Associate Professor of Education and Policy at the University of Southern California. This is old. I'll let you do that. I'm reading this going, that's not right. Dr. Strunk's research is focused on three aspects of educational governance: teachers' unions and the collective bargaining agreements they negotiate with school districts, teacher evaluation and compensation, and accountability policies. Eric Taylor is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He studies the economics of education with a particular interest in employer-employee interactions between schools and teachers, hiring and firing decisions, job design, training, and performance evaluation. And with those brief introductions, I will turn it over to the panel.
On the screen, the way it moves up here. So maybe I'll just see how to make it also move here. I'll just do that. Okay, so I'm going to start with a very quick summary of some of the educator workforce issues in California. This will be familiar to many of you. We've had, since about 2015, worsening teacher shortages in the state. In 2016, about 75% of districts said that they were experiencing shortages. The next year it was 80%, and in both cases, most of them said they were growing worse. Oh, so I'm... Ooh. To switch from PowerPoint to Slido results. That's an adding.
Try.
Control Alt D. I'm having trouble advancing the slides because it was. So I can advance them either on the screen or on the... How do we get that slide to show up on this? You're going to give me an extra minute, right?
While we're waiting, do you
Yeah,
want to take these in the room? We have.
that's a great idea. Why don't we go around and just say who you are and what organization you're with.
Hi, I'm Derek Mitchell. I'm a CEO of Partners in School Innovation. We help school districts support their most challenged schools.
I'm Miranda Martin. I'm the Director of Policy at Parents for Public Schools in San Francisco. Hello, Claire Davis Howell with the Advancement Project.
Terry Clark with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing.
Amy Lee, Legislative Analyst Office.
Lisa Gonzalez, Association of California School Administrators.
Shannon Brown, Executive Director, San Juan Teachers.
Michelle Reininger, Executive Director of the Center for Education Policy Analysis at Stanford.
Kirsten Slungard Mumma, doctoral student at Harvard Graduate School of Education.
And Samantha Tran with Children Now.
Hans Fricke, Pace.
Terry Jackson, 6th grade teacher in West Contra Costa and also on the CTA board.
Chelsea Kelly with the Assembly Education Committee. Diana Lambert, the senior reporter for InSource.
I'm Mark Rosenbaum, I'm with the Federations.
I'm Elise
No,
Gallagher
this is
with
what we're
PACE.
trying to get rid of. We're trying to get the slideshow up. Sorry. So that should show when we go into advance. No, but see, it's not. This is not advancing. There we go. Okay. Woo!
Thank you.
All right, there you go. Uh-oh.
Okay.
All right, shortages are getting worse. Why? There are three big factors. There's been a rapid decline in teacher prep enrollments over really more than a decade. Once the recession was over, districts wanted to rehire a lot of the people they laid off to return to somewhat more reasonable class sizes, and we have teacher attrition. About half of the current credentials that are being issued to people who are not fully prepared. They don't have preliminary or clear credentials. Underprepared teachers are on the rise, and the most worrisome part of that is that the red piece of the bar are folks who are on essentially emergency permits. They're not in any kind of an intern program or other training program. We have a 5-alarm fire, especially in special education. 2/3 of the people coming into special education teaching are not fully prepared to teach, and of course they have the most high need and vulnerable students. And while we are producing a few more credentials in special education, the demand is even higher, and that's because the attrition rate is extremely high. Shortages, as usual, vary such that high poverty schools and schools with large concentrations of students of color have the most acute shortages. Rural areas also have very acute shortages, followed by high poverty urban areas. And of course, shortages disproportionately impact students of color and low-income students. For those of us who've been around for a while, this is like deja vu all over again. We were here in about 2000 before the Williams lawsuit, and we're very rapidly slipping back again. Turnover is also higher in the high poverty and high minority schools, and is extremely high in rural areas as well. Interestingly and importantly, turnover is extremely high for teachers who are identified as not highly qualified. In California, this means teachers who are essentially on emergency permits, because interns do count as highly qualified under the law. And you can see that the attrition rates in every content area are much higher. If you go all the way down to world language, you can see that 40% of underprepared teachers leave each year. That's extreme. And under self-contained classrooms, that includes both special education and elementary teachers, typically. But very few elementary teachers are coming in on emergency permits. Many special ed teachers are coming in on those permits. So this is really a proxy for special ed attrition until we can get the data sets that everybody's going to talk about that are needed to lock that statistic in. African American teachers also leave at higher rates. So California is very good at recruiting teachers of color. About half of the people coming in are teachers of color, about 1/3 of our total teaching force. However, we're not as good at keeping them. And that's partly because people who teach in high poverty, high need schools, which is disproportionately the place where teachers of color locate, turnover at higher rates, and teachers who come in without full preparation, turnover at higher rates, and those disproportionately represent teachers of color. So in terms of policy considerations, we want to build on recent investments, both to expand pipelines with high retention pipelines like teacher residencies, opportunities like targeted service scholarships and loan forgiveness that keep people in, get them fully prepared and keep them in once they are there. We need to rebuild mentoring for novice teachers. BITSA sort of has been undermined in recent years by the lack of a clear mandate to districts, as well as resources that they must apply to that purpose. And also, principals are very important. Teachers often leave because of the fact that they don't have supportive principals. And we have high principal and superintendent turnover as well. 1 in 4 principals leave their jobs every year. 1 in 5 superintendents leave their jobs every year. Inexperienced principals are actually the mobile principal in California has 1 year of experience, and that represents 20% of principals. We know a lot about high quality preparation and professional learning. It's applied, it's in networks or cohorts, there are partnerships with districts, there's a focus on instructional leadership, organizational support, and design, and using data for change. Recent completers, here's a bright spot, suggest that many more of them have had this kind of preparation. The Commission on Teacher Credentialing, I want to recognize Terry Clark, who is like the heartbeat of the commission, has been raising standards for administrators, and I think we are seeing results of that. California principals, 9 out of 10 want more professional learning around social emotional learning, whole child supports for young people, using data to inform continuous improvement. So there's a huge demand out there for professional learning. We did get rid of the California School Leadership Academy in past years. Many principal training programs are gone. We have to rebuild that infrastructure so that, in fact, administrators can get that kind of training and build on the new standards, the new performance assessments for administrators, the strengthened accreditation process. We had Cal-Ed grants that could contribute to that, but they lasted only a year. So we have a long way to go. I'm going to end with this set of policy considerations. We have an emerging statewide system of support that's going to be redefined over the coming years. We need to be sure that targets professional learning for leaders. We need to take advantage of Title I and Title II opportunities to underwrite professional learning for leaders. That's on the horizon, but not yet landed. We should be thinking about how to build a much more robust pipeline of folks who can not only come in with strong preparation and mentoring, but also stay and then continue to stay the course with the improvements that are underway. And I'm going to pass the ball.
I'm Catherine Strunk from Michigan State University. Great group of co-authors with me on this paper, so we're really excited to present it today, including a number of students, so I want to make sure that's clear. And we find a lot of the same things that Linda was just talking about, using kind of a different set of data and asking a somewhat different set of questions. And so we were ambitious. We came with a lot of questions. We wanted to understand something about the shortages in California from a different perspective. So we used the data from EdJoin, which has a good percentage, about 85% of the districts have their vacancy postings up on EdJoin. And we wanted to understand where are they posting, what kind of vacancies do we see, and that was something about shortages. We also coded all of the contracts in districts with 4 or more schools, which we've done for 5 rounds of contracts now, which takes a lot of effort. I know a lot about labor union contracts, by the way, if you want to ask. And we were able to understand kind of what are the local policies that are affecting teachers in each of these districts, and we combine these to understand how they're associated with each other. We also wanted to ask what kinds of students have access to the high quality and highly qualified teachers, and if there are access gaps. We are unable to answer this question because the CDE is unable to provide us with those data. So we don't have data on teachers over time, not consider students. They worked hard, we worked hard for over a year, and we were not able to get those data. Okay, I kind of went through my 4 sets of data that we're using. I don't want to go too much. We also have the salary schedule data from the contracts, which will be critical for our work. We use as our sample about the 500 districts in California with 4 or more schools. Okay, so our first question is, what do districts' vacancy postings tell us about California's district staffing needs? Here you can see just the timing of postings. So this is great data from EdJoin. We really appreciate you giving us access to these. And we're able to show over time, when are they posting their jobs. And what you know, right, is that if they're posting them kind of in the late summer, early fall for that school year, they're posting them pretty late to get teachers. And this graph shows us, and the red line is for the high poverty districts, the kind of gold line is for the lowest poverty districts, and the green is for the average or overall. And you see that the postings peak in July for the highest poverty districts with that red line, but they peak in May for the low poverty districts. So that means that the low poverty districts are getting access to the teachers earlier. And in fact, you also see a lower proportion of late postings in the low poverty districts. So they're front-loading their postings and getting access to their teachers first. The same thing for if you distribute it by achievement and especially by urbanicity. Urban districts are posting much later than suburban and rural districts. Uh-oh. That was not supposed to happen. So you can answer that question. D. Okay. Eric is the savior here.
Reading pieces of paper.
He's good at that. Less than a quarter of the postings across the state were for elementary school teachers. So this tells us, that's interesting. We also see that about 21% were for STEM. Other includes non-STEM secondary education teachers, and then special education teachers are about 14% of job postings. So that's interesting, but if you thought about how do you think about that in terms of what the actual need is. So we generated what we call the relative needs ratio. Basically, we did this by taking a national survey that we can generalize for California and showing what proportion of teachers in California are of each of these types. So for instance, 21% of postings are for STEM teachers, but only 16% of California teachers are STEM teachers. That means that there's a relative need ratio of 1.3. Districts are posting for more STEM teachers than they actually already have, right, on average, because they need more. But elementary teachers, you can see, are only a need ratio of about 0.6, right? So they don't need as many elementary teachers as they have, that are being produced. This kind of gets to one of the main points that we kind of make throughout our report, which is that shortages are real in California, but they're not universal, right? And so we don't have as much of a shortage for elementary teachers as we have for maybe STEM teachers, special education teachers, EL teachers, or even this kind of big group of other teachers. Here we look at so this is kind of hard to read graph. So the blue are vacancies per 1,000 students. This is kind of a vacancy ratio, right? This tells us the vacancy need. And then the red lines are duration of the posting. So how long are these postings up? This is a pretty noisy measure from EdJoin, which they've kind of given us the heads up to take it with a grain of salt. But they still have sort of interesting findings. So you see here, the first on the left are the lowest poverty and the highest poverty, sorry, you're right, you're left. The lowest poverty and the highest poverty districts. And we show that lower achieving district, and then achieving. We show that lower achieving districts have more vacancies that are posted for longer than the high achieving districts. You don't see quite the same pattern for the low poverty districts, except for the fact that when you go to the broad sample, not just the 500 districts in the CBA sample, but the full California sample, you see the exact same patterns. So basically, this is a factor of bigger districts being in the sample. So again, this tells us that the lower achieving, or the harder to staff districts, have more vacancies, have more need, and they're having a harder time filling them than these higher achieving districts. And the same thing for the rural patterns versus urban. Location also matters a lot for vacancy rates, posting dates, and the duration, right? And so we put an indicator in for if you're on the border in California. And the reason we did that is because there's more competition, right? You can actually think about these districts in the California border could be going over the border to teach in Nevada or Arizona. And then also we looked at how far you are from a teacher education preparation program. We did that because we know that oftentimes the people who train in a TEP will teach closer to that TEP, and if they have their student teaching in an area around that TEP, they actually get hired and work there. So border districts have higher vacancy rates, and districts that are farther from their teacher ed program have higher vacancy rates, fewer late postings, and postings that are active for a longer period of time. So it's harder to staff, right? These border districts and these districts that are farther away from prep programs are having a greater difficulty getting qualified candidates. Okay, so then we looked at the district, the CBAs, and we looked at a ton of the kind of provisions in the CBA. We didn't want to show you everything. It's in the full report on the website. What I wanted to show you here is we generated desirability indices. I'm not going to go into how we did this. It's all in the report. But basically what we tried to do is read the CBAs and said, how desirable are the working conditions in the contracts for all teachers, kind of on average. For teachers just in shortage areas, teachers who are new to the district or who are just new to the profession, and then teachers who are veteran teachers who are continuing. And you can see, so the green tells you when it's kind of higher than average significantly, and the blue is when it's lower than the comparison group significantly. And I kind of want to just make one specific point here. So urban districts, with this first kind of column here, urban districts seem to have contracts that are more desirable for the average teacher, but substantially less desirable for shortage teachers and brand new to the district teachers. The things like new to the district are when you can actually transfer salary credits over, right? And so can I transfer 1 year or 7 years of salary credit over, or do I not transfer anything? Things about shortage are like, do I provide an incentive in my salary schedule, so a bonus for math teachers or STEM teachers or hard staff teachers in some way. Rural on the opposite side, right? So rural have seemingly better ways of attracting new teachers. They're more likely to have things like these economic incentives for hard to staff teachers. I also wanted to point out kind of this low versus high poverty change, right? And so you see that low poverty districts tend to have contracts that make them more desirable as opposed to high poverty districts. Although high poverty districts are doing more to try to recruit their shortage area teachers. We also looked at class size provisions and school day and year length provisions. We didn't see any difference across kinds of districts. Okay, salaries. Salaries do differ across district types. So rural districts pay teachers less at every point on the salary schedule, and they give smaller yearly raises. This is when we look at the straight contracted negotiated salaries, or we actually adjust them for cost of living. Urban districts pay teachers more and pay them more at every point on the schedule when they don't have a master's. Low poverty districts pay teachers more at every point on the schedule and have higher wages, which is not surprising to all of us. But when you adjust it for cost of living, then this kind of goes away. And high poverty districts actually pay teachers more in their first 5 years. When you adjust for cost of living, what you're really getting is that this rural-urban difference, right? Okay, so we, just for time, I'm going to look at just the number of posted vacancies. And we see that when you kind of do a quick regression and you regress the vacancy rates on these kind of contract and salary variables, you find that vacancy rates are lower in districts with higher negotiated class size. That makes complete sense. It's just math, right? But they're also lower in districts with higher salaries throughout the schedule. They're lower in districts with greater early returns. So when you're paying novice teachers more every year, giving them higher raises every year relative to the senior teachers, you have lower vacancy rates. They're higher in districts with greater backweighting when you flip it, and when you pay senior teachers more every year as a raise on the salary schedule, you have higher vacancy rates. And they're higher in districts with CBAs that are more desirable for continuing teachers. So when you make your contracts better for the veteran teachers and not as good for the novice teachers, you have higher vacancy rates. So some policy implications. Staffing shortages are real, but not necessarily universal. They differ across subject and location. Salaries matter, right? This is not news to anyone in this room, but it seems to be news to some people. Salaries do matter. So districts that pay more overall and that give novice teachers more early in the salary schedule have less difficulty with staffing. So what can we think about for policy solutions? Well, we could pay teachers more, and particularly for teachers in high-need subjects and locations. We could create lower barriers to entry for out-of-state teachers, so make it easier for teachers from other states to come in, and make it easier for them to not just in terms of, think about pensions, think about certification, and then consider how teacher education programs can work with remote districts to improve student-teacher replacement and recruitment. I think that's all I have time for.
All right, good morning. Thanks for coming out. In this particular report for Getting Down to Facts, Virginia Lawson, who is a graduate student at Harvard, and I were asked to focus on teacher evaluation programs. So, if you're sitting in this room, it's not a surprise to you to realize how there's been sort of a resurgence of focus on teacher evaluation and public school management policy over the last decade or so, but that has looked very different outside of the state of California than it has inside California. State level programs are more common outside of California. Within the state, here, individual districts have taken the lead on developing innovative ideas. Some of them have been working on these innovative ideas for many decades, but certainly over the last sort of focused decade. So what do we do in this paper? I'm not going to be able to tell you about all of the details, but what do we discuss in this paper? We discuss sort of the potential for evaluation programs to promote teachers' effectiveness in their work. That is, we're focused not on the sort of nuts and bolts of the particular, of all of the nuts and bolts, I should say, of teacher evaluation programs, but particularly on the decisions and choices that need to be made in that design process that might promote the effectiveness of teachers, rather than just using those evaluation programs to decide whom to retain or to let go. So, and you know, we're not going to try to propose a particular evaluation program for every district in the state, but rather talk about the key issues that you all might be interested in thinking about as you're working on designing these programs. So there's lots of opportunity for improvement. There's been some talk about, Susanna this morning and others have mentioned, the survey that was done of lots of different stakeholders, including teachers and principals. And most teachers, sorry, this is kind of small, but about half of teachers in the state, when asked, said that their sense was that teacher evaluation was mostly or entirely, or at least primarily, to grade teachers for accountability, while the other half felt like evaluation was at least somewhat to help teachers improve their teaching. So there are about half of teachers today who are feeling like, yes, this is an endeavor, evaluation is an endeavor that's intended to help me improve, not just to grade me. But there are half that don't feel that way, so there's plenty of opportunity for improvement. The paper really focuses on 4 different themes of contemporary teacher evaluation. I'm going to talk about the first 2 this morning, but I'm happy to talk about the other 2 in the discussion, and we talk about them in detail in the paper. So let me just say a word about multiple rubric-based classroom observations. Again, if you're in this room, you probably have these kinds of pictures in your head. Another adult comes into the classroom, observes a teacher actually teaching, and scores that teacher using a detailed rubric. So this is an example from Poway, where some particular teaching skill is described in 4 different ways. One way is ineffective practice, approaching effective practice, and accomplished practice. They all look basically the same. Here's an example from Los Angeles that's probably a little bit out of date now. This one is about asking questions in the classroom and generating discussion. And again, different kinds of teacher practice are described in detail under each level of effectiveness. So, you know, why might rubric-based classroom observations actually help a teacher improve? You know, the first reason is the rubric itself, which is describing what effective teaching looks like in practice. So those help to structure the observations and the scoring, but they also potentially do other things. They can create a clear, shared expectation among teachers and administrators for what we're all trying to do to improve. And they can actually guide individual and group efforts to improve. So if I'm a teacher who feels like I want to improve in asking questions in the classroom, this is one source of information about what I might do, because it describes what an effective teacher would be doing when they're asking questions in the classroom. More generally, the rubrics create an opportunity for conversations among teachers. Sometimes those are required, that is, the observer has to sit down with the observee and have a conversation, but they're not always required. So there are opportunities around these rubric-based classroom observations that are not just about scoring and deciding who's better or worse, but create an environment and opportunity for improvement. And there's some evidence, which we talk about in the Getting Down to Facts paper, from places primarily outside of California, that actually this can be true, that we have seen improvements in teacher performance when teachers are evaluated using these kinds of programs. So I think we're still waiting for Catherine and others are working on some evidence from Los Angeles, but that's not in this report. But let me show you a little bit of evidence from other places. So here's a graph, a picture from a report on Cincinnati's public schools evaluation program, which uses these classroom-based observations. And what's going on in this picture is we're following individual teachers over time, and the red dashed line is the year in which they're evaluated. So before that line, they've never been evaluated before. During the year where that red dashed line is, they're evaluated using this classroom observation rubric-based evaluation program, a peer assistance and review program. And then you can follow them after the evaluation ends. And so what you see is that there is this educationally substantial improvement in teacher performance as measured by their own students' achievement test scores after they participate in this evaluation program. So Cincinnati is not the only place where we have some evidence. Chicago had a pilot program a few years back where they randomly assigned schools to participate in a program like this. And in those schools that were randomly assigned to the treatment group, teacher performance also improved. There's a few of us who are working on similar experiments in England. These are not in the report because they're just that new, so just in time for all of you. And my co-authors and I, studying secondary school teachers, do again find important improvements in teachers' performance after they participate in a peer evaluation program that used a detailed rubric like this. Other people have tried similar peer evaluation and observation programs, but without the rubric, and so far at least, they're not finding improvement. So it may very well be that the rubric itself is sort of core to making these kinds of improvements, but we still have a lot to learn. I think the evidence is fairly evaluated as encouraging and promising and exciting, but we still have sort of a lot to learn. There are things to be concerned about, certainly. These kinds of rubric-based multiple classroom observation evaluation systems are costly, most notably in the amount of time that it takes on behalf of the evaluators and the people being evaluated. But the potential benefits that we've seen in Cincinnati and Chicago and English schools would easily swamp those costs in the long run. That is, if teachers get better and stay better, many students will benefit from the costs that we pay. Just a quick word about the second category, and then I'll finish. So the second category of things we talk about in the report is connecting explicit, intentional program design elements that connect individual evaluation results to resources and strategies for improvement. So the most important version of this has been around for a long time and was partly developed by districts here in California, and that's peer assistance and review programs, where there's a very intentional, I come and evaluate you, and then we have a conversation and work together on improvement over time program. And there are great examples of that in California. We talk about some of them in the report. There are some more innovative things in Long Beach. That there are some sort of intentional relationships between Long Beach's professional development program, MyPD, connected back to evaluations through the teaching standards. And then in the report we talk a little bit about partnerships and mentoring programs where individuals are paired up based on, to work together based on results from their evaluation program. So people go through these classroom observation-based evaluation programs, and then they have a mentor or a partner who helps them think about how to improve on those programs. And in Tennessee and in the My Teaching Partner program from the University of Virginia, again, we see large, important improvements in teachers' performance as measured by their student test scores. So those are two of the things we talk about. We also talk about these so-called multiple measure evaluation programs, and a big category which people often talk about, attaching consequences, positive or negative, to evaluation results like pay or tenure and things like that. We talk about all of those in the report, again, with the specific hope of thinking about how they might or might not help improve the performance of existing teachers. So I'm happy to talk about those things or other things as we continue the conversation. Thanks.
very much. And now we have some time for questions.
I have two questions. The teachers who are leaving and the teachers who are coming into the profession, do you have a sense from your data whether we're losing effective teachers, whether the teachers who are coming in are more promising than 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And then the second question I have for you is, so you talked about some factors here. If you had unlimited resources, what would you do to both maintain quality teachers and draw more teachers into urban districts and districts already serving disadvantaged students?
You're looking at me, Mark. Should I start and then anything want to add? And now our mic is on. Okay. If by effective teachers you mean, some link to student test score data, we don't have that statewide. So we're looking at just the nature of training that people have. And the folks who are part of the challenge is the attrition rates of the people who come in with less preparation. As you can see, the attrition rates are much higher. That's true in national data. People who come in without preparation are likely to leave at 2 to 3 times the rate of those who come in with preparation. And those who get good mentoring are likely to leave at lower rates than those who don't get mentoring. So you get kind of a double whammy of if people come in without training and are not getting good mentoring, you're getting a lot of churn. That affects achievement in a couple of ways. In high churn schools, in high turnover schools, you have lower achievement. And the turnover itself can cause some of the ways in which the achievement is depressed. In addition, teachers are typically much less effective in their first at least 2 or 3 years of service than they are later. So if you're having a beginning teacher force that's coming in underprepared, unmentored, leaving rapidly, the kids who are in that circumstance are getting less effective teaching on average. It's not to say there aren't ever, beginning teachers who are, effective, but on average, they're going to be less effective than having a more stable and effective teaching force. We also did some work recently looking at studies that used what we call fixed effects methods, and it looks as though when you compare teachers to themselves in an earlier part of their lives, teachers do gain an effectiveness for more than the 2 or 3 years that often show up in cross-sectional studies. So, I think part of the challenge that we can tie to effectiveness is early churn, that you need to get people in, you need them to come in with enough preparation that they feel both confident enough to stay and hopefully are more competent. So a lot of the ways in which we think about strategies have to do with both retention. 9 out of 10 vacancies are occurring because they are people who left the year before. And so we've got to do something about that. Obviously, there's some people whom Erica's worrying about who should leave, and others who might, with rubric-based evaluation, get better. But a lot of our problem is that early churn that we need to really take account of, and of course, it affects high minority, high poverty schools the most. I hope that's helpful. We talked a little bit about residencies. The state just put $75 million into residency models for preparing math, science, bilingual, and special ed teachers, which are the high shortage areas. Typically, well-designed residencies, like the one, we have about a dozen in the state, have much higher rates of retention. You get to study for a year under the wing of an expert teacher while you get your credentialing and coursework. Typically, you get some kind of a stipend and free or reduced tuition. The retention rates are much, much higher. In San Francisco, for example, about 80% of those teachers stay in San Francisco for 5 years. About 90+% stay in teaching for 5 years, even if they can't afford to stay in San Francisco, as compared to 38% of their other teachers who come in. 100% of the principals say that those teachers are more effective than the other beginning teachers that they hire. So that's a particularly well-designed residency, but we're hopeful that we'll get more of those and expansion in that regard, in addition to other strategies.
I would add one thing to that. I think that's all right. I think it's on.
Okay.
It's on. I'm just not close enough. We have some work out of the Los Angeles Unified School District about their new teacher selection program, which I think people often don't think about as much. And so when you have a situation like with elementary school teachers, or in Los Angeles they have a lot more teachers than they have space for actually apply every year, which is definitely a luxury. They're able to put in place a pretty rigorous selection system in which they can try to assess the things that they think are important about teachers from the get-go. So they're not coming in blind. And they really reformed it over the last few years. And we have a study out, Paul Bruno, who's actually here, led that study, that shows that if you are careful with the selection system, you can actually screen for teachers that are more likely to stay and have higher, at least value-added measures of effectiveness and higher rubric-based observation measures of effectiveness later in their careers. So that's a pretty good deal, right? And they're also likely to stay in the schools in which they're placed. And so that's also important if you're thinking about churn and worrying about teachers who are kind of moving around the district really quickly. So I would just offer that as another potential solution.
Yeah. And I would say that's a great point, and it goes with what Catherine found about the fact that urban districts in particular hire later and often haven't figured out how to balance early enough hiring with good enough screening to get people in early so that they can start and be successful. Because typically later hiring often means lower quality hiring. There's some other literature on that.
Just one quick thing to add. We've talked about hiring and that decision. We've talked about probably the most important thing, which is that turnover early in the career. But one thing we don't know, not to at least I'd be a person who doesn't repeat the theme, one of the themes of today. One thing we don't know is about the effectiveness of individual teachers in the state. So there are a lot of questions we can't answer. So we can't answer. We know that we know things on average about first and second and third year teachers, but we don't know whether the particular first and second and third year teachers that are leaving or staying are the ones that are more or less effective. And there is some research from other states that suggests that when teachers leave later in their careers, that the ones who are leaving and taking jobs elsewhere are more effective, at least as measured by their contributions to student test scores. And why are they leaving? One important reason is that they're making more money outside of teaching, and that's true. That's true in other states, and it's almost certainly, as Susanna was mentioning this morning, true here in California, because the compensation within teaching is much lower.
Other questions? 1, 2, and 3.
So you mentioned briefly about out-of-state teachers and the barriers to coming into California. One issue that I've worked on is the credentialing process and trying to streamline that. You also mentioned pensions. Can you talk a little bit more about the barriers for out-of-state teachers?
Yeah, I can, and I'd also point you to a session breakout in the next session with Corey Cordell, who did a whole study on this for it, in fact. But we actually have one paragraph in our report that shows that if you are the same teacher in Nevada and California, and you want to move from Nevada to California, you will lose something like 35% or 30% of your kind of pension wealth if you make that transfer over to kind of go when you're about 40 years old. And that's just, we pay almost the same amount in terms of returns. It's literally just you lose your kind of returns to seniority. And that's a big barrier. So I'm a teacher living in Nevada and I want to move to California and I'm a good teacher. That's a pretty big financial hit. And so we need to think a lot about how we would, as a state, address that if we're thinking about kind of pension portability and things like that.
Isn't that local district decisions about the Kaplan experience?
Probably so. And again, Corey is someone who would know far more than I about that.
About 25% of our teachers come in from other states, so it's a very important piece of supply. And rules for reciprocity have gotten a little better over time, but there's still some, glitchy issues that teachers encounter aside from the pension, lack of pension portability. So I think that's, it's an area to be concerned about. And while the salaries are a little better in most of California than they are in many other states, the cost of living is so much higher that there's not an adequate compensation. If you move from Nevada, in fact, I've had to go to Las Vegas every summer because my son does Ninja Warrior stuff. It's always the competitions there. So I get these cab drivers who talk about how they used to be teachers, and they also say how much cheaper it is to live in Nevada and drive a cab than it is to be, trying to deal with the cost of living in California. So, those are all issues that we have to contend with.
Oh, yeah, I just had a question about, do you know anything about the importance of sort of local cohorts in terms of teacher preparation? Like, there was a slide about how having local programs is helpful, but do we know, is any of that about having like a peer group or the social networks? And I was thinking in terms of teacher residency programs as well. Does that help with the retention of those teachers?
There's general literature that shows that collaboration and being in a cohort and having a peer group that you get to collaborate with is important to teachers. And that principals who set up those kind of collegial settings in schools, that can help with retention. And certainly well-designed residency models do put people in cohorts. They even, in the case of some, have them placed in teaching academy schools that are designed to be a place for multiple teachers to learn to teach, and they're doing a lot of work in cohorts. So I think that nobody's kind of pulled that out and said this is the magic sauce. It's part of the magic sauce maybe, based on other research.
I think we can also learn something from alternative certification providers here. I think there's some research from those programs that show that if you place teachers in cohorts, they're more likely to stay and enjoy it rather than sort of be by themselves in a sea of hardness. Difficulty, thank you.
Last question, and then we're going to move into table discussion.
So in the data that you showed about the difference in the timeline of hiring in low poverty districts versus high poverty, my assumption, so I'm going to check to see if this is true, is that part of that would be fueled by the fact that when lower poverty districts have vacancies, they are potentially drawing from higher poverty districts, which fuels that, but then they would have to post those vacancies later. So because people are moving, filling these positions, it would create a later vacancy? Is that what's...
So we don't have that in our data, so I can't speak to that definitively. I think that is probably a part of the situation, and you've done some work on this too, Linda.
Yeah, a lot of times late hiring is a function of several things. One is the district's capacity to get ahead of its budget and vacancies early in the year. They should be surveying teachers and figuring it out and trying to predict and project. Another is that sometimes they have very cumbersome processes that they don't manage very well. Or they may be processes by which, particularly in big districts, this is often true, that you have to offer a vacancy to other teachers internally who want it before you can post it and do it externally. If you don't manage that process extremely vigorously, you can slow yourself down to the point where you're not doing hiring until later. Then there are the horror stories that have come up over the years. I remember them in New York City before they did some reforms, and in Los Angeles before they did some reforms, where people would apply, they would not hear back, they would come, they would stand in line. Our teacher over here is nodding. Maybe you had that experience, where you can't get attended to. People lose your file. I mean, there's all kinds of inefficiencies that can occur in a big hiring process. And if you don't streamline that and really get a hold of it, there's lots of FIGMAT reports in California that I've read that describe, actually some of them in the Williams lawsuit, that describe the fact that districts sometimes are just not on top of the hiring process to do early hiring. Now, the state used to have late budgets, and that was a big excuse. Now that legislators can't get salaries and can't get their paycheck until they pass the budget, we're doing a little better on that, but that also used to be a big reason.
Sometimes.
That one really does.
Okay.
Can I point one thing out quickly about the pensions? California is one of only 15 states where you don't get Social Security as a teacher. That is another huge disincentive for someone to come into our state if they're in a state where they do get Social Security, and for second career people to go into teaching.
That's a good point.
Okay, we now have time for table discussion for about the next 15 minutes. Talk in your tables about 3 questions. You can choose which one speaks to you the most. The first is what stood out in the data on teachers in California. Second, what barriers do you see standing in the way of necessary reform in this area? And the last, based on this research, what do you think should be the top priorities for the next administration and legislature?